What up, everybody? What up? What up? What up? And it's the MICCASTERJ. That's me, the Mic Caster. And we're back with T.T.P. And this is the final countdown. Okay, but that's what we calling this episode right today. We calling it the final countdown. Why? Because we are at D-Day, right? We are at the moment. We are at the apparent destruction of whatever was taking place with humanity and some other stuff that was getting intermingled that we saw in chapter 6, right? And right now, our boy Noah is about to be flowing in the breeze. Right. So there's a lot of context that we're going to focus on here. And again, we're going to do from the perspective of God. Right. I really want to help get us out of the habit of making these biblical characters the pinnacle of the story. The biblical characters are not the pinnacle of the story. They are just a transference of the pivotal point that God is using to clarify what God is doing within the story. Right. They're a marker. That doesn't mean they're not important. Doesn't mean God didn't turn around and choose them without a reason. It just means that don't overemphasize the point and then take that attention away from what God is doing, right? And that's what we're going to focus on in this part, in this point, because right now, I am me, you are you, this is this, here we go, is T.T.P. And welcome back, everybody, because right now we're at the big show, right? We've arrived at the moment, the disaster, the flood, the destruction, the coup de grace, right? The epitome, finality. Okay, I'm done. We're here, right? At the part where God is doing exactly what he said he was going to do, right? And whatever you call this moment, right? This marks the key difference in the exchanges between us and God forever. And that is Noah's representation in this story. The dynamics of us and God and how it changed, right? So although Noah is singular, I need you to turn around and put it in there and see him as an us, right? And this is ultimately humanity's new relationship between God and him, between us and God himself, right? God itself. That's another topic for another day. We'll get there. But yeah, so here's what's important, right? Here's where we're gonna go, right? We're gonna break this down for you. And we're gonna do it in this story, once again, through more perspective of God's and versus what we usually would focus on in this part, right? So one thing to recognize inside here off the back, right, is God's omnipotence, right? So God already in this moment specifies how and when and even where down to the very moment, right? That all this is going to happen, right? Also, even including Noah's age, right? So the other thing I want you to understand is how God inspired the author of this, right? To also convey the importance of this moment. So I need you to understand that when you are reading the flood moment, you are not reading it as a story. You're not reading it as a bedtime thing, as churches have made the bad habit of doing, as songs have made the bad habit of doing. You are reading this in the context of history, right? And this part that we're going to break down is going to make you understand that this is made to be embedded in your mind to understand as history, right? This is an historical context part of the Bible, which the Bible does have that throughout itself, right? Because sometimes context is key, right? Because people are always quick to turn around and be like, the Bible's just a book. No, there's aspects in there that complete what it is. Now, there's parts where people create stories and stuff like that that are inspired by God to illustrate what's going on in real context at the time. That's important to understand. But there are specific points in the Bible where no, this context is meant to be taken as this happened, right? And this is one of those. So, one thing off the back is, why is it significant that Noah's 600, right? Well, because God ensured that the work required for this ark to be built can be completed, right? Because it took a minute before we got to this point, and that was a lot of building. Again, Noah was building the Titanic. He built the back in the day Titanic, right? Unfortunately, Noah doesn't have a crane. There's no crew staff. You don't got a union, right? So all this was going to take time, right? Got to make sure that Noah had the specific time, and as you can see, he even gave back a little bit of that divine aging that was present in the beginning, right? Where you live for the longevity, and he gave that to Noah, right? So that's significant to understand that. Like, Noah was given a little bit more of the divinity that we lost, right? A little bit more leeway in order to complete God's mission, right? It also signifies that Noah is lifespan, right? Because Noah also wasn't an old man. So the other thing to understand, that during the time when this was happening, right, when people used to really live for a long time, what we would have considered old was not old, right? So Noah at this time is in the prime of his youth. And he's infused with the word, which he even turns around and further strengthens that youth, right? When you pushed and you're so forward in God, God can give you the ability to do all kinds of things, no matter what pinnacle of your life you're at, right? The other thing is that God even specified how many animals, right? 7 pairs, not 2. I'm very sorry, but the Bible, you got to read it in context. And the only thing that there was 2 pairs of that we get confused were the unclean animals. But the animals that were not unclean, which we'll go into, were in groups of 7 pairs, right? 7 pairs to ensure that there was enough. And again, we'll go into why that is, right? He even emphasizing on Noah and his family entering the ark, right? So God did not only just acknowledge Noah, he acknowledged his family. And the flood coming, and the animals pairing, and creating a migratory instinct in the animals, right? So what does that mean? The migratory instinct is heritable, right? Is urge to travel switched by hormones triggered by changes in day length. For lack to throw the science out the way, God pretty much instilled in animals and communicated them to get their butt on the boat, right? Because again, Noah was a farmer. And although there might be a little bit of animal incorporation in there, Noah is not dealing with lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, right? So you got to be able to grab all these animals, right? You got to be able to get all these animals to generate to one place specifically, right? And I don't know about you, but Noah wasn't about to turn around and do all of that. So Noah's only goal was to build a boat. God turned around, and again, being God, being omnipotent, being all powerful, made it happen so that the animals were right there in place where they needed to be at, right? Come on. The second thing, right? God's grace. So to the point, right, of ensuring not to perish, that of what he has covered, that being Noah, right? God told Noah to take 7 pairs of the animals. Why? Right? This is where we're going to get into some of these things. One, when it comes to clean animals, you need to understand that this was still in the pivotal time of sacrifices, right? So God not only prepared animals that would continue the line, so that the way these clean animals survive, but God gave Noah animals that he can use for sacrifices to turn around and stay in communication with God. And God even gave Noah enough animals to eat, right? Because the clean animals was really big on eating habits, on the survival, right? So he gave Noah more than enough supplies and resources, right? Without Noah even realizing, to be able to survive on the boat for the length of time that he did. Okay. Now, the other thing is that God even notices unique characteristics of different species of the same animals, right? Thus, you have of its kind, right? So God not only put the species on there, God also separated them by their distinctive ways within their species, right? Which is amazing. That's just, again, the detail of God, the understanding that when God turns around and covers something, he covers it in its entirety, right? It's not just a one-off and he just generalizes it and prejudice and everything like that. No, God covers it in its entirety, right? The whole thing, not half, not a little bit, the whole thing, 100%, right? So we got the characteristic species belonging to one's nature, natural, native, and then, okay, clean and unclean. So God didn't only bring the clean animals, God brought the unclean animals included, right? And understand, even though we're using words unclean at this context, this is before the laws, right? In Leviticus that people will read later, right? Which is Leviticus 11, 1 through 47, which we'll get into, right? And that is, stand by, when they turn around and talk to you about what is it that you can eat. However, Jesus would later come and squash all that, right? Colossians 2:16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment. And that word is carino, can mean to condemn, right? So let no one condemn for the consumption of what they eat, right? So what's important to understand is that Paul, the apostle, to the Colossians, abbreviations Colossians, 12th book of the New Testament, right? Addressed to the Christians at Colossae, Asia Minor, whose congregation was founded by St. Paul, the apostle's colleague at Pharos, right? He's talking to them, right? In regards to the questions of food and drink, or with regard to the festival and the new moon or Sabbath. And Jesus absolves us from all that, right? So ensuring that we're not judged by all of that. Anyway, I say all of that to turn around and say that when it comes to clean and unclean, all you need to know is that the animals that don't chew cud, which is the reprocessing of food, right? So it's brought through the mouth of the animal and it's brought back in, and then not split hoof, right? And then the animals that do the opposite, right? So why is this important? Because the animals that usually do that specific nature are eating off of the ground. They're eating off of what God's has given. They have all the things that are required for nourishment in our bodies, right? And the animals that don't are the ones that we shouldn't, right? They have gaminess. They got carnal issues that they're not related to any of that, right? So that would be like reptiles, amphibians, horses, donkeys, hawks, shellfish, all that, right? Anyway, but moving on from that, right? So the key to understand is that for this time period where God was very consistent in the sacrifices for nourishment, even before the Mosaic laws, Genesis 4:4 being an example, it's still important to turn around and do that, right? So God communicated from what we gather from what takes animals specifically for what purpose, right? And the other thing to notice inside here that's important, which is number 3, is God is attentive, right? So the repetition is consistent where God keeps track of everything, right? So the fact that it repeats itself, the fact that God inspired this person to tell you what's happening each and every single time, it's God's attention, right? God's attention to detail. God is always focused on what is happening at all times, right? Again, that all-knowing, right? So we are getting a clear depiction of God's omnipotence. Phrases like they went in upon the earth after their kind, even and the Lord shut him in, right? God is presently understanding of where everything at is all times and is keeping tabs. And that's incredible, right? And you're seeing it in action inside the chapter, and you probably didn't even know that. You read that multiple times, and all you did was pay attention to the fact that everything was happening, right? It's going down, right? But you didn't even notice the way God is working in that chapter. God even remembers the breath of life in each animal that each animal carries. So God even understands the way that he created and still remembers how he created animals to the very day. All right. Now, the thing to also understand, right, is aquatic animals get their oxygen through water due to their gastrovascular cavity inside their bodies. Right. So the thing to understand is that the aquatic animals were not destroyed. Right. For this curse was for what was on the ground. Right. It's also understood that in the Bible, the water is not cursed. So whatever, all the stuff that happened before in the beginning, the water was not part of that, right? So the water is not cursed, which is why it's used as a healing factor, which is why it's used as healing throughout the Bible. If you read multiple chapters, multiple scriptures, right? So the aquatic animals were untouched. So if you ever had that question, yes, aquatic animals were untouched. They're not even remotely mentioned. All right. Now, the next thing to also understand when it comes to this chapter, right, is destruction requires a lot of work for God. And I don't mean like God can't do it and he gets tired and stuff like that. It's just a lot. And what we never really thought about that, right, is how that hurts God. That's the last thing God wants to do, right? So God single-handedly had to make sure that everything was destroyed, right? 7:21 through 23, right? God had to ensure that nothing was left and spent a lot of time doing so, 40 days, right? So picture a Lego set, right? You took all the time to put it together and put every little detail, and then picture somebody just crumbling it down and dismantling it, right? And that's what God had to do to his creation. And that can't be easy, right? That cannot be easy, because I know I wouldn't do it, right? I wouldn't want to destroy what I worked so hard to create. And God had to do that, right? And God had to watch that process. And that process was grueling and it was long. And it means that while he was doing it, he was watching his creation suffer. They are dying in real time. They are drowning, right? Again, we hear destruction and we got to understand that it's messy, right? We often overlook those moments in the Bible, and those moments are messy. So, 40 would also become a significant number for testing and purification, right? So we see the first act of purifying inside here within those 40 days, right? Example, Moses on Mount Sinai with Exodus 24:18, Deuteronomy 9:25. The spies' trip to Canaan, Numbers 13:25. Israel's time in the wilderness, Numbers 14:33, 32, and 13. Elijah's journey to Sinai, 1 Kings 19:8. Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, which is Mark 1:13, right? And God has to apply great lengths for the destruction, right? So 7:19, and the waters prevailed. That word, Hebrew root word, gabor, right? Which is a military term meaning overwhelmed. So waters overwhelmed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the hills that were under the whole heaven were covered, right? So God is sending the land back under, which is the opposite of Genesis when God was pulling the land out. So again, undoing his whole process, and that's grueling, right? So, picture God just being in a lot of pain with that, having to destroy his creation, having to restart the process and everything like that. Just think of in the mindset of when you're creating, when you do a game and stuff like that, when you draw a picture and then it all goes to waste because it got destroyed. Like, think of that, like the agony of that. And God is sitting in it and he's handling it, right? The next thing is, the first passage is so complete and specific that it's impossible to reconcile a local flood with the biblical record. So in other words, this flood was giant, right? People like to argue it only happened in one spot. No, this flood was giant on a global scale, right? So Psalm and 2 Peter even referencing the flood second, right? At least 200 cultures have their own version of the world flood based on the Institute of Creation Research, right? So that's 88% describe the favorite family that survived the flood. 7% mentions a boat. 95% says a catastrophe was solely by a flood. 67% mentions that animals were saved. 57% records a survivor ending up on a mountain. So this was global, and you have proof outside of what we know as Christians, right? Which is also important. Sometimes it's nice to give people a little bit of context because, again, God leaves crumbs everywhere. So you need to not only know the biblical crumbs, you need to know the outside crumbs, people who don't believe in what we believe in, right? And sorry, a lot of sneezing, but I'm gonna wrap forward into this, right? So we can wrap this up. But third, God uses an insane amount of water to destroy everything, to cover the hills. So 22 feet to be exact, right? Which doesn't seem big now, but at the time it's huge. The fourth great waters were above the firmament, right? So Genesis 1 and 7, the waters that were above in the sky, God opens that up. So you got giant downpour, rainfall, and torrent, and you got the waters flooding and coming up from the depths of the sea, the sea caverns. Like I'm giving you a picture, a vivid image of what's happening, right? So the next thing to also understand in that regard is last 2 points that I'm going to make, right? And then we're good. So God's protection, right? The ark floated above the destruction and maintained its ability to float, right? So the ark had no oars or rudders or anything of that nature. I need you to understand, like, this is a boat of boats. Like, this is a rubber ducky made of wood. And all it did was float, right? And God, in his protection, made it float so succeedingly that it floated above what was happening below, right? And even getting to safety afterwards. And that's a word for somebody, right? God will carry you across the chaos and have you floating above untouched while everything is happening underneath you. So, God sustained the animals in Noah for 150 days. Don't overlook that. The waters did not recede, right? So Noah was on there for a long time. 723, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So God not only protects you, but God protects those that you impact, those that you touch, right? Even going back to the beginning where the Lord shut him in and God sealed the boat, right? So God kept Noah through the midst of the chaos and never forgot about Noah and kept him safe, right? So that leads to the sixth thing. God keeps his promise. And when God said that Noah would not perish, all of life would, but Noah would not, God meant it. So God's promise to you, whatever that promise is, God said it to you and God meant it. And God, regardless of whatever's happening in your life, whatever storms are coming, whatever floods are happening, whatever chaos is going on around you, is going to keep you and is going to protect you and is going to ensure that the destruction doesn't overtake you. It's going to turn around, stay attentive to what's going on with you. It's going to turn around and give you grace, right? It's going to turn around and exalt his omnipotence over you, right? In order to ensure that his promise is kept. So this has been a T.T.P. I know it ran a little bit long, but I like to make sure I don't leave like blank moments in the midst of this, but I'll catch you next time. All right. Love you guys. Peace.